Hello and welcome to Round Robin. I'm your host, Robin McCormick, with the City of Hampton's Communications and Marketing Department. And today we're going to talk a little bit about the early history of Africans in Hampton and in the New World, or the British New World. And I have two guests who know much more about this history than I do, Cassandra Newby-Alexander and William Alexander. And you are both Norfolk State professors.
Yes.
And have a little bit different perspectives on this, right? Cassandra, you focus on the American history and the African American history.
Yes, that's correct.
And William, you're more of a international history.
Yes, world history and specifically European history.
Okay, and how all this ties in, of course, is very important. So let's talk just a little bit. I know you have an event coming up and we're going to promote that, but let's sort of review the history and also why it's important to mark the history. Obviously, the beginning of slavery in this country is a really painful chapter that many people would prefer to, let's keep that book closed.
You know, it's interesting. I usually like to say that slavery is actually more than a chapter. It's most of our history. And the legacies of slavery is an ongoing part of our history because it produced segregation and discrimination. And that segregation and discrimination was actually there almost from the very beginning with the arrival of these Africans.
Right.
And so we wanted to create a forum for discussion, both among scholars and with the general public, to actually start looking at who we are as Americans. We call them these enduring questions. When did we really begin becoming Americans?
Right, we were called Africans for so long. There was no acceptance of them as Americans for many, many
or
years.
Or even the people who were British coming over, when did they really become known as Americans? And the Native Americans who were here, when did they really become known as Americans?
The new America that became after.
So our focus is on the
them.
Convergence of these three groups and the hybrid societies that were created around then and beyond, and so on.
And it's really a fascinating chapter. And in fact, our argument is that America did not really start forming as America until 1619. Because it's at that point that you not only saw the arrival of the first Africans to British colonial America, but you would see the arrival of large numbers of English women to the Virginia colony, and you would see the beginnings of I guess, a transformation, and in some cases really a devastation of the Indian communities, not only in Virginia but throughout the area along the East Coast where the English were settling. And so it's that point in time that begins to really change us. And so what are some of the ethnic groups coming into what would be colonial America at that time? What were some of the diseases that were being introduced, the animals, the plants? People think here in Virginia that the peanut is indigenous to Virginia when the peanut is actually from South America, and it didn't get here immediately from South America. It came via Africa as well as Europe. And so looking at those stories really highlights the complexities of a global society that didn't just start in the 21st century. It started much earlier than that.
You know, that is a really different perspective. I have not had anyone put all those pieces together. Usually you look at maybe what happened to the Native Americans, what happened to the slaves when they came in, and to fit those pieces together, it was, I guess, the beginning of melting pot kind of place that we are today.
There's also a broader context, what we call the Black Atlantic, in that during this period, of course, the movement of Africans to the Western Hemisphere, and of course, at different times, the movement of Africans to other areas of the planet. And in point of fact, here we develop what we call the Black Atlantic. And you can focus on the English dimension of that or the French dimension or pull it all together. And what we're doing with this conference is bringing in scholars to talk about all aspects of the African diaspora and how it created sort of a Black Atlantic, but also, as Cassandra said, mixing with these other groups and creating very complex hybrid societies. And in addition to the things she was talking about, we put a lot of emphasis on perspectives, how indeed people looked at Africans and their descendants, how they looked at Native Americans. What about foodways, the exchange of foods in addition to diseases and animals and plants? All of this was part of what in some cases is called the Columbian exchange, but for our purposes we're also looking at dimensions of the African diaspora, since the program is sponsored by our Roberts Center for the African Diaspora Studies.
So tell us, people may not be familiar with that term diaspora. What does that mean?
Well, diaspora is simply dispersal. And of course, the first usage of this phrase comes from the Jewish diaspora. And as you know, Jews during the Roman period were forced to go in many different directions. Well, now that term has been used in many directions. We use it, for example, if we talk about the Armenian diaspora, or the Greek diaspora, or the Italian diaspora. For our purposes, of course, there is a lot of scholarship now that's being done in what we call the African diaspora. And it has to do with, of course, the migration of peoples, the forced migration, in some cases the free migration. Mm-hmm. It has to do with issues of identity, mixtures, remembrance of things past. So there's so many dimensions to this. It's a very complex field, and there's a lot of scholarship being generated in this direction now.
And some of that scholarship is pretty recent, I would assume.
Recent, yes.
I mean, it was not African-American history is fairly recent as a scholarship field, as a major. I mean, it just was not studied for so long.
Right. In fact, it really wasn't until the 1880s and 1890s that you started to see growing scholars, early scholars, who were focusing in a more professional way on talking about researching and writing on African American history. You think of Carter G. Woodson, but even before him, George Washington Williams, a Norfolk native who actually escaped through the Underground Railroad in 1854, was perhaps one of the earliest to begin writing books about African American experiences in the war. He wrote The Black Phalanx. His name was Joseph T. Wilson, and he actually worked here in Hampton for a while, publishing a newspaper over in Norfolk, which was his home base, in Richmond and Petersburg. He was all over the place. And his book is still used by scholars today because he went around and interviewed all these different African American soldiers who served in the United States colored troops.
Wow.
So this history, you know, a lot of people think, well, history is just names, dates, places, but it's also telling stories.
History's wars.
But history is much more than that. It's the anthropology, it's the biology, it's the literary perspective, it's the foodways and customs, it's all of these things. And what we're trying to do is bring together this multidisciplinary perspective that also includes the oral histories, the family histories. We have the Tucker family, for example.
Let's talk about them a little bit, because I was going to ask you for an example, and it's sort of the go-to example in Hampton, but...
Yes, the Tucker family of 1624, their ancestor came in to Point Comfort, that same place that the first Africans arrived, and it is where Fort Monroe is today. And when they arrived, they were purchased by Tucker in Hampton, and this is the group whose family says that their ancestor was the first child, the first African child born here in America. And they've been able to trace their ancestry all the way up to the present day. And so we have them coming to our conference, and they are providing for teachers who come to the conference as well materials that they can use in their classroom to show students how family history is history, and how you can incorporate the family history to really learn about the history of the nation. Because if you look at this one child born, what did this one child and his ancestors see from that point in 1624 all the way to the present?
And how did they, research that history and keep that history alive? I mean, they must have had to go back and piece together things. Yes. And the documentation wasn't always good, really for almost anyone who didn't have money, but particularly for slaves.
Well, for a lot of formerly enslaved people, it was very hard to trace their ancestry back. But because this family was unusual in that they didn't move far from their place of origin, while most African Americans, their families were sold all over the place. And so they're unique in that they have this place, they have county records, they have birth records, they have cemetery records, church records, to help them to trace their ancestry. And fortunately, this family passed down the history, at least the oral history, and then they had other family members who dived into the records to really uncover and go back beyond 1870 and go back to the early 19th century and even further back to the 17th century. And so they're unusual because most families in America can't trace their ancestry back that far.
That's for sure.
But what has also helped them is that the College of William and Mary started a project back in the 19th century documenting the history of a lot of the prominent citizens who owned property. And they left a lot of very telling details in those records, and that helped the family to also trace their ancestry.
It's amazing. Now, would you call William Tucker the first African American?
No, I would call him the first African born in America, because African Americans suggests that first of all, we had an America.
True.
And it took a good 100 years before people began to identify themselves who were English as something other than English.
Right, which wouldn't have been America even after 100 years, probably.
Yes. And what they did was they typically would identify themselves based on the colony that they lived in. And they were starting then to develop a different dialect, a different accent. And that accent was determined by all these different ethnic groups who were coming in.
Even within Virginia, I assume there would have been quite a few.
Well, I mean, you take into consideration that you had a multiplicity of Indian groups and all their different accents. And then you had a multiplicity, growing multiplicity of African ethnic groups. Yes, we started with a lot of people from Angola, from the Congo, but pretty soon you had people from Senegambia, what we call Senegal and Gambia. You had people from the Calabar area, which we call Nigeria. You had people even from Madagascar. I'm surprised when I look at the records, and back in the 18th century, 20% of the enslaved people were designated as coming from Madagascar.
Wow, I did not realize that. It's not the one you hear.
Sure.
And so, you know, all these different ethnicities, not to mention all the different ethnicities coming from England.
And, and the Native Americans had a lot of different habits and cultures.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
And you know, not everyone was coming from Norfolk County, England. A lot of people were coming from Scotland. They were coming from the London area, all over England. And so all these different accents were coming together, and it took a little while to develop a different accent and style. Because even in Virginia, wherever you go in Virginia, you're going to hear a different accent. And that's because of the kinds of people who were living there. And in Hampton Roads, this was a very confluent area where you had a lot of people coming in and out, lots of ships coming in and out from the Caribbean.
The shipping makes such a difference there in making this area cosmopolitan for its day.
Yes.
And so the accents are very different than if you went to Northern Virginia, or even if you went into the rural areas of Northern Virginia, the accents are very different. Or going south into Southampton County, the accents are really more North Carolina accent. And that's because of the confluence in those areas.
And then there are also the religious mixtures and so on. You have not only traditional religious ideas of the Africans, but you have a lot of Africans who were Islamic by that point, who were Muslims and so on. And then the Native American religious movements and whatever. So putting all that together with Christianity, you have hybridization in that direction also. And it creates more specific cultures here in North America.
So you really look at the cultures and the way of life and the influence on the people.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit more about this conference. And I know it's specialized and it's maybe more academic than the average person.
Well,
we're
actually,
reaching out to everybody.
Actually, we have a unique approach. It reflects this hybridity that is a part of America, and that is, yes, we have some academic presentations, but we also have roundtable discussions where we invite scholars and community people to come in, talk about a topic, present a few things for about 10, 12 minutes, and then have a conversation of those attending. Last year we had students who mostly from Norfolk State who were there who actually apologized because they had to leave to go to their class. They were so engaged. We had people sitting on the floor. Some of the sessions were so packed because the discussion was intriguing, it was interesting, it allowed them to contribute, there was back and forth. So we created this very hybrid conference. We also, for this year, have invited 2 historical interpreters to come in and to give a historical interpretation of Anthony Johnson on the first day at Hampton, which is the Hampton Roads Convention Center. And this particular historical interpreter, Jerome Bridges, who is being provided to us by the Yorktown Battlefield Park, he is going to interpret Anthony Johnson, who was an African who arrived very early, probably 1621. He was, like most of the Africans who were brought here, considered unfree. Their status was really undefined. And what that really means is there was no term.
There was no formal institution of slavery,
well,
but there was
no
co-opting of the idea.
Yes, I mean there was no end date for their term of service.
As opposed to a lot of the British people who came over as indentured servants had contracts.
Yes.
Contracts for a certain number of years.
Right. And so Anthony Johnson worked essentially for almost 30 years as a servant. He, at the end of that, he was given head rights in Accomack County, I should say. And right at the point when he was to become a freeholder, the House of Burgesses changed the rules so that he couldn't vote, making it only white men could vote. And so the story of Anthony Johnson connects what we're talking about this past and rule of law with even present day events. And that's why we're going to also have a session looking at the Voting Rights Act, race and law, and the Trayvon Martin case.
Yes.
And so you do really make that connection from 1619 to today and the events.
We're also, by the way, reaching out to more this year to high school students and trying to get them more involved because, especially with their SOLs, but generally just for the sake of knowledge, they need to know about these ideas from the people who are generating the history, in a sense.
Right, and then you're working with teachers, too, so that they can pass this down in their classroom, because this is a little bit of an untold story, at least in the mainstream classrooms. Yes, you can take those classes in college and specialize later, but it isn't always woven into our history textbooks in that way.
By bringing it all together in one place and doing this in subsequent years, it shows the audiences and so forth that indeed it is all of one piece, so to speak. It is all dealing with one phenomena. And indeed it has many varieties, and it all can be fitted in. And so I think it gives a more integral approach.
And that's why we've also made the cost of the conference very low. It's, it's $40 per day or $75 for the 2 days. One day, as I said, September 26th will be at the Hampton Roads Convention Center.
And I will add the Hampton History Museum is co-sponsoring
It's the co-sponsor,
that.
And we start at 10 a.m. and then the second day will be at Norfolk State University's Student Center, and we start at 10 a.m. there as well. And we actually have programming that goes into the evening from 5 to 7 p.m. We have entertainment, and it's educational entertainment. It's teaching people about the music and the dance and so forth that were really important to this history, but from an entertaining perspective. And we're hopeful that people will go online and take a look at our schedule. It's www.1619makingofamerica.com, all one word.
Okay.
And we're hopeful that people will come and take the time to even look at some of the podcasts that we have online from last year's conference.
That sounds great.
By the way, there are reduced rates for students too.
Okay, that's good.
Yes.
That's good to
Yes.
know. Well, thank you. I really look forward to it, and maybe having you come back each year and begin to tell this story in a broader way, especially for those who can't make it out to the conference. Thank you so much for
Thank you
coming.
very
It's
much.
nice to see both of you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. I hope you've had an interesting taste of history and how the different cultures blended together, and that you may want to explore it further in the conference. Thank you for watching.